Yeah. It's, oh gosh, it's taking a little while to get set up on the website. And Rachel will just be popping it up. Just waiting for Rachel to confirm that it's all up, and then
okay.
I'll pause for a second and then I'll launch. I feel like this bit always takes a wee moment. Apologies. Okay, I think that's us ready to go.
Okay.
So, I'm Peach from the Lighthouse bookshop in Edinburgh, and I'm here today chatting with Guy about his book, The Peckham Experiment. And so we're just going to jump right on in, and I'm going to introduce Guy and why I picked the book for our subscription. If I can find it. There we go. So Guy Ware is a critically acclaimed novelist and short story writer. His stories have been listed for numerous awards, including the London Short Story Prize, which he won in 2018. The Guardian described The Fat of Fed Beasts as brilliant, the best debut novel I have read in years. Guy was born in Northampton, grew up in the Fens, and lives in southeast London. Personally, I would describe The Peckham Experiment, as the best book that I've read this year. I actually picked this title for our December subscription box, honestly, because as a Londoner, I was intrigued by the title, and I had heard very briefly romantic stories of the Peckham Experiment. So I was quite intrigued, and then upon reading the blurb, I thought it incredibly serendipitous that a fictionalized take on the intricacies of council housing would immediately follow my reading of Show Me the Bodies, which was a newly published book last year on the Grenfell tragedy, which we actually used for our politics subscription, Beacon. So that's why I started it, and we're really going to get into the meat of a lot of the things that I just mentioned there. But I suppose to kick us off, Guy, if you have anything to add about yourself, and then we can jump straight into a reading from you.
Okie dokie, thank you. Well, as you mentioned from the brief intro, I live in southeast London now. I live just around the corner from the home of the Peckham Experiment, and I'm sure we'll get back to that a bit later on. But also, as the blurb suggested, I'm not a native Londoner, but I moved here in 35 years ago, something like that. So probably been accepted by now. I hope so anyway. After publishing this, it may be a different story. I thought what I'd do, if that's okay, is kick us off with a brief reading, partly because I'm a show-off, partly because if you haven't read it or you need a bit of a reminder, I just thought it would be a good way into the voice of Charlie, which is so kind of central, Charlie being the narrator of the book, so kind of central to the way that it's written. I'm going to read from very near the start, and as I said, if you haven't read it or you've got a short memory, you don't need to know very much at this point, merely that, as I say, Charlie is the narrator. He's trying to write a eulogy for his brother, whose funeral is the following morning, and so far he's got as far as a single sentence, which goes, "The day my brother retired, he killed a woman, not for the first time," and his niece Diana is not terribly impressed by that as an opening. So Diana says, That was 30 years ago. She means the last death, the last time JJ killed somebody. You're hoping everyone's forgotten? I mean, there's no need to mention it. But what else is there? She does that thing she does, tucking her hair behind her ears with both hands, running them round her chin. It was cute when she was 17. She's been calling me Uncle Charlie for almost 70 years now, since I was 17 myself, and more like a cousin, really, than an uncle. Sinatra, see, it was a very good year. Sorry about the voice. It was a very good year. It bloody was, I tell you, 17. It was 1948, the year the NHS was born and all the rest of it. You're his brother, Uncle Charlie. What am I supposed to say to that? You should tell some stories about growing up together. Say how committed he was to building decent houses for the poor. Say you loved him. That's all anybody wants to hear. That's what she says, and I nod. It's the longest speech I've heard her make in years. I give her the impression that I think she's right after all, that it really is that simple. I even say, you're right, though we don't call ourselves the poor anymore, do we? We don't. I'm not poor, not anymore, and neither were you. But that's not what I mean. We talk about disadvantage and low-income families. At a pinch, we might just talk about poverty as an abstract noun, like Beveridge's giant evils, want and squalor, and God help us about social mobility, as if it was all about a few smart kids getting richer, a few smart kids like us. But never, not ever, about people being poor, about poor people. It's not polite. It's demeaning, as if being hungry enough to feed your kids from a food bank and living 6 to a mold-covered room you might get kicked out of tomorrow weren't demeaning enough. And I don't say any of this. Diana smiles and clicks her teeth, relieved. I'll be here about 10 to pick you up. I get around. I could get there on the Easy Rider. Not a bad way to turn up at a funeral. Pale horse be damned. Don't worry, I say. It's no trouble, she says. Except it is, isn't it? For her, driving through the Rotherhithe Tunnel at rush hour. I can't think what possessed her to move to Mile End. A man, a job. I'm going to vote first, I say. You should too. I don't say it's what he would have wanted, which would be laying it on too thick, even for Diana. She says she supposes so, though it won't make much difference where she lives. It won't make much difference here either. Harriet bloody Harman isn't going to lose a 25,000 vote majority. That's not the point, I say, piously. We vote, it's what we do. There's nothing she can say to that. She offers me tea, I decline, and so she leaves at last. But on her way downstairs, she says, I'll see you at 10, and shuts the door behind her. It's 4:15 p.m. I have 18 hours. Surely that's enough. What about a drink to lubricate the gears? Not yet. It's only tea time. Not that I've ever been one for all that sun below the yardarm bollocks. A drink's a drink, whether it's 10 in the morning or 10 at night. How long is it we've had all day opening? Years. Decades? Possibly. Wasn't it Blair? Opening hours never meant that much to me. Don't get me wrong, I love pubs. Still do. I love the noise on a Friday night and the quiet on a Tuesday afternoon. I love the beveled glass and the polished wood, the peanuts and crisps and the barmaids you can flirt with and the young men at the bar who don't flirt, at least not with barmaids, and the landlord banging the bell and telling us all to bugger off, and yes, he does mean bugger. I love the beer and whiskey, the brandy and the gin. It's just, for me, pubs have never been the only or even the best place to drink, and I'll tell you what else happened in 1948. Larry Olivier made Hamlet. This I know, because Angela dragged us to the Tower on Rye Lane to see it twice, because, she said, it might help us with our exams. And after that, she always thought she was quoting the Prince of Denmark on a Saturday night when she said, there's nothing either good or bad, but drinking makes it so. She was wrong, of course. She had what Diana might call a problem with alcohol, if Diana could ever bring herself to talk about her mother. The problem being, naturally, that she couldn't get enough, tish. Then JJ and I grew up and her kids grew up and she discovered that booze was more important than paying the bills and it wasn't a problem for a while. But for most of the 60s, she was fun to be with as long as you got to her early in the day, which was fine by me. I had other things to do at night. Then the bank tried to repossess Tony's Hillman Hunter and all of a sudden it was a problem. You tried to stop me seeing your mother then, didn't you, Diana? You said I was an enabler. Even Francis told me I had to stop bringing sherry. And I listened then because it was Frances, Angela and Tony's second, more lovable daughter. But you were never the problem, were you, JJ? Never an enabler. I placed both hands on the head of my stick and levered myself out of my chair. It's a knobkerry, the stick. A beautiful word, a beautiful thing. Ash or birch or some such. I'm not really one for trees. It's none too practical for hands as palsied and cramped as mine. but beautiful all the same. I tell Diana I keep it because if push came to shove and shove to assault, I could still crack a man's skull with its heavy, polished knob. She doesn't believe me. These days, I mostly use it round the flat. I keep the rollator by the door, a walking frame with wheels and a nifty fold-down canvas seat for when the walking gets too much. I try not to use the scooter unless I have to, even though it's an easy rider and cool as fuck, as I believe the saying is, or was. I get around. I keep the stick because beneath it all, I'm a sentimental fool. I hobble to the kitchen, fill the kettle at the adapted tap, and make the tea I refused from Diana. I shall leave it there.
Thank you. It was nice to hear it in a voice that isn't the weird one in the back of my one that's me, but not quite. I suppose the first thing that comes up for me when reading or hearing it as just then is the narrative structure, the way that you are absolutely totally in Charlie's head until someone, in this case Diana, brings you out of it, brings you back to reality, rather annoyingly it seems, for Charlie. So I was wondering why you chose this narrative structure.
There's a couple of reasons, really. One is a kind of it's kind of fairly straightforward craft of writing novels point. There's the book has to look back over a long time, from the 1930s up to 2017 when it's set. More focus on some areas than others, but dipping in and out of a lot of periods of that history. And that would either be a 1,000-page social history textbook, or if you're going to make it a readable novel, you've got to have a way of being able to jump in and out in a way that nonetheless keeps some kind of cohesion. So you've got a voice, you've got the single narrator, and you've got a single point in time. I knew from fairly early on it was going to be set over one night, because it just gave me as the writer, it gives you, I hope, as readers, a kind of anchor you can come back to. You know where you are when he kind of reminds you that you're in the flat. Time sort of gradually ticks past over the course of the night, and it helps, I hope, keep the whole thing together in a way that it could easily have fallen apart. As for the voice, I suppose to the kind of Charlie's voice itself, that was quite an interesting one. I'm always very suspicious, if you like, about writers who say, oh, my characters take on a life of their own and they take over and they tell me what's going to happen, because I frankly don't believe it. But
fair enough.
But in this case, it kind of did, because what happened is I originally thought it was JJ's story, the novel, The Other Brother, and the other brother is well, he's a bit of a blank canvas in a way. He's more dedicated, he's more clear about his ideals and his commitments, and then they get twisted and broken. And then he does nothing for 30 odd years, or does he? But certainly in Charlie's view, he does nothing. That's actually quite hard to write. And fairly early on, I found, slightly to my surprise, that Charlie's was kind of elbowing his brother aside and saying, let me tell you about him. And so it kind of grew from that. And it's the kind of mixture of that and thinking about, as more and more of the pieces started to come to fall into place for the book, kind of what kind of bloke would he be? How would he talk? And he's a kind of weird mixture of all kinds of things. And there's a passage I wrote in there kind of explaining that about, why does he talk the way he does? Well, it's kind of all these things that he's read and listened to and all the people he's spoken to, but it grew out of him, as I said, kind of elbowing his brother aside and saying, "Let me tell you a story."
Is that why you chose to make them twins, to make that comparison a little easier and that shoving?
Yeah, I think it's because it ups the kind of competition angle on it. You know, there's various references to kind of famous twins through history, and Jacob and Esau in the Bible, and Romulus and Remus, and those are stories of rivalry. And whether JJ believes he's in a rivalry or not, Charlie certainly does, and he's kind of forever kind of measuring himself against his brother. He's quite supercilious at times. He kind of thinks his brother is boring, frankly, thinks his brother doesn't, you know, never did kind of appreciate his wife. But he's also kind of, Charlie, this is anxious about, you know, actually was his brother the better man all along? And it's that kind of anxiety, I think, that kind of drives a lot of the story, and a lot of Charlie's kind of self-justifications and his rants, and, you know, both kind of good and evil in a way.
Yeah. I mean, he does seem to fancy himself quite a bit, does Charlie. But I think what is also quite interesting is that I feel like for a lot of that time that's really slowly ticking away over those kind of 18 hours, while his memories are coming thick and fast, is maybe a fear that actually it's not him who's won the race. It's not him that's won. It's maybe that his brother has, you know, like completed his lifespan, so he's really, he doesn't have to live with those anxieties and I suppose the reckoning of what he's done, the death of those women. Yeah, I think
that's, and a few men, but yeah, that's, I think that's right, and it's, you know, whether that's true or not, I think is, hopefully there isn't a straight answer. But because that would be a more boring book if there were, I think. But even in Charlie's version of the story, you know, when he goes, you know, they lose touch for a long time, and he goes back and tracks his brother down and so on, and they meet up. And at that stage, it becomes clear that whatever Charlie thinks about, you know, how wrong his brother was to retire early, or how boring he's been, you know, the risk of spoilers, there's a degree of happiness that that JJ has found that Charlie hasn't. Although, you know, there are hints of that in Charlie's life too. There's, you know, he's found a friend in his you know, in his next door neighbor, and it's a sort of slightly distant friendship with Mrs. Vega, but you know, but there are, you know, there are some glints of light in there, as well as the anxiety about their past.
Yeah, I mean, that is such an interesting thing about this book. It's just so full of anxiety, which is, I don't know if it's much of escapism of the anxiety of living in the world that we do, but yeah, I think we see Charlie's anxiety about aging, his memory retention, you know, he counts backwards to make sure he's still got it. And then it's also, we've got these kind of anxious dealings and scenarios that are happening in his history, all happening within quite an anxious city as well. So I was just wondering why, if it was an accident, or if you really chose to have anxiety as the emotion that drives the novel.
I don't think it was that conscious, but I did recognize it, you know, when you say that. So there are bits about, you know, just kind of incidental descriptions about the kind of, because he's been awake all night or most of it, and the city is waking up and it's kind of getting ready to rumble, basically. And that just kind of fit in the context. And as you say, I think that is part of a kind of, you know, it's a world in which he goes out in the middle of the night on his scooter, and again, don't want to give away too much for people who haven't read it because I don't want to spoil my punchlines, but you know, there are some anxiety inducing moments as he drives around in a slightly vulnerable state. But the underlying point, I think, is about, you know, what was the driver? Well, one of the for the novel in the first place, and it's that kind of, we seem, from my perspective, to be losing a lot of the kind of pillars of the social contract, if you like to use a particularly early 70s phrase, of the more broadly of the welfare state, the sort of post-war world that I grew up taking for granted, and then spent a long kind of professional career kind of, I guess, helping to dismantle, which is slightly worrying. That wasn't what I was consciously trying to do, but I worked in finance in local government for many years, and essentially what I found myself doing was taking lumps out of public service budgets and trying to do it in the least damaging way possible. But nonetheless, that's kind of what I was doing. And kind of looking back, and so many of these things, as I say, that we'd kind of thought were, that were genuine progressive gains, have nonetheless been lost relatively easily. Some quicker than others. And so the anxiety bit, I think, is Charlie, who's older than I am, had a longer career than I did, but is looking back at that. And it's kind of almost that kind of, you know, cliche joke about it, but that kind of Mitchell and Webb thing, you know, were we the bad guys? It's that kind of, you know, was he, how culpable was he for, you know, what went on? How culpable was his brother? How much were they just doing the best that they could in their circumstances? How much were they closing their eyes to some of the downsides of what they were doing? And, you know, there are all kinds of reasons why they take different approaches to it and so on. But fundamentally, you know, housing is where it is, the country is where it is, London is where it is. How much, you know, how much pride can they take in that, and how much blame do they have to shoulder for it? And it's that kind of anxiety at the end of a long life, I think, about, Christ, was it all a bit of a cock-up?
Yeah, well, I think you kind of half answered the thing that I was going to jump off on there about, I suppose, the psychology of people and our actions, and then maybe the way that we remember them as well. Because you do have Charlie, who kind of has this a bit of a just doing my job mentality, which, as you say, I mean, how responsible, how culpable can you be, especially when you enter jobs that you think are meant to prop up something good, something that you might have taken for granted beforehand, propping up the welfare state. So I was wondering if, I suppose, why it was that you wrote a character who's so opinionated and so defensive, but so complacent about things at the same time.
Defensive, yes, but you know, aggression is the best form of defense, I think, in his mind at least. So I'm not sure complacent's quite the word, but self-justifying, certainly. But to go back to the kind of trigger for that, and I think, you know, the unspoken bit, the bit that we haven't talked about yet, is the more specific trigger for the book. As I say, the kind of broader context was anxieties about what's happening to the welfare state. The much more specific trigger, almost unusually, I think, for a novel, as you know, I can pinpoint precisely, was Grenfell. And you mentioned Show Me the Bodies, and it's, you know, it's the unwritten bit in this book, because the book is deliberately set the week before Grenfell happens, so that obviously none of the characters know that that's around the corner, but readers will. And that was a trigger for me, because, as I said, I've worked in and around local government and bits of central government, working with local councils for decades. And, you know, I knew and worked with people in Kensington and Chelsea who were bound up in all of that, and whose reactions afterwards I found very difficult, because, you know, the place was basically exposed and fell apart. But the underlying, their ability to manage the crisis, you know, irrespective of their culpability for the crisis, their ability to manage it afterwards was just, you know, it was appalling, frankly. But I can kind of see, you know, they were paralyzed by the scale of it and the disaster of it, which is not an excuse, but it's a description. But the point about the culpability is, and again, this is in no way intended to excuse or exonerate or you know, let off the hook in any way at all any of the people involved. But I know, you know, I've signed off big property development contracts. I haven't read them. I've signed them. I couldn't tell you what the building quality standards in were for the school that, you know, I built, my council built, or the houses we built, whatever. I was doing a particular job, which was about making sure the numbers worked. People were doing jobs they thought they were doing. In some cases, there were others who were, you know, frankly, knew that what they were doing wasn't right. They knew they were selling products that were substandard and so on. But a lot of people, particularly on the council side of it, you know, were basically, I think, doing what they thought was the best job they could do in the circumstances, and those circumstances weren't great, but nonetheless, you know, they weren't being actively evil. The outcome was, you know, utterly disastrous. And, you know, it is not the first time. You know, other buildings have caught fire. Things should have been learned and weren't. But the point is that the point for me, and the point therefore that I wanted to start writing the book about, was, you know, come back to that anxiety point. It was people like me who found themselves in that situation, and I could kind of see how. And I wanted to write a book that was about how do you get to that point where that can happen, you know, without it being anybody's intention, obviously, but also without it necessarily being kind of purely a case of, you know, right and wrong and good and evil. That then flashed me back to, I mean, one of the fairly early reactions I had at the time was thinking about Ronan Point, which I'm just old enough to remember. Many people aren't, so, you know, again, if you haven't read the book, if you have, you'll know, but if you haven't, Ronan Point was a tower block that partially collapsed in 1968 in a block in an estate in Newham in East London. And again, you know, what was going on there were lots and lots of drivers for people to build what turned out to be unsafe structures with the best of political motives. You know, they were clearing slums, they were getting people out of some really, really horrible housing conditions, and trying to create some, you know, modern, clean, warm, light, pleasant environments to live in. And you know, 5 people died at Ronan Point, and it was, you know, only by good luck that it wasn't more. You know, the good luck being that it was 5:30 in the morning and most people were not in their living rooms. So, you know, but, you know, it's bad enough, frankly. So it wasn't. So I had these kind of two disaster points, if you like. One of which, as I said, I was deliberately not going to write about directly. partly because I wanted the story to be about how we got to that point, not about the disaster itself, because I think that's that's somebody else's story, frankly, and I wasn't going to get into trying to write the story of the victims or their families or whatever, because I just, that's not the story that I had to tell. What I wanted to do was talk about how we got from here to there, when how do I put this? There's a sort of straightforward story, if you like, that I started telling a minute ago, which is that the National Health Service and the welfare state and everything was a great progressive advance, and then it's sort of gradually been allowed to decay. And that's a sort of nice, neat narrative arc. The reality is, of course, it was never that nice and neat. And Roden Point is a pretty obvious example of how along the way, at the high point of social democratic Labour policy and government in 1968, when lots of other progressive things were going on, these buildings were falling down because they were shoddily built and there was lots of corruption going on. So what I was trying to do, sorry, this is a very long answer to a short question, but
no,
what I'm trying to get at, I think, is that kind of, as I say, there is a simple story, and simple stories are beguiling and almost always wrong. So I was trying to get to think through the character of Charlie and his brother, how those kind of one step forward, two steps back, three steps forward, kind of the kind of real way that history and social policy moves actually happens, and to kind of sort of stir it up and complicate it a bit, which of course I guess brings us on to the question that you haven't asked, which is about the Peckham Experiment itself.
I was
just
I'll
let you answer the question while I drink some water.
Yeah, if we've got these two kind of disaster points, why the Peckham Experiment? Why is that the title? But also, why is that our initial setting? And then the physical space of the flat that we stay in throughout the novel.
So it's that complication process again. So the Peckham Experiment is a real thing. Again, for those who haven't read it, here we go. There's another book you might want to read, which is it's called Being Me and Also Us, which is about the history of the experiment, which was a 1930s initiative that in many ways is very modern, and in some ways that we might come back to, quite problematic. But it predates, obviously set up in the 30s, it predates the war, it predates the welfare state in its kind of broader sense. It offered, in some ways, this kind of idyll to a working class population. The building that it was housed in is an absolute palace, 1935 design. It shows all that kind of, ambitious modernist architecture. Lots of glass ceiling over an enormous swimming pool. It had a gym, it had tennis courts, playgrounds, lots of equipment. Members could use it at will, if you like, once you paid your membership. So kids would go there after school without their parents. They'd go and hang out, they'd go and play. There were bicycles and roller skates and a swimming pool and a gym and and if you think about what the life around them in 1930s Peckham must have been like, it's this kind of beautiful Edenic kind of paradise in a way, and as it happens, it's just around the corner from where I live. The building is, and I used to walk past it whenever I was going to work. So I got kind of fascinated by the history of it. And again, what it's doing is it's showing, in some ways, the slightly more complicated version of the world than the stories we like to tell ourselves. So yes, it predates the welfare state. It's a fascinating initiative. But kind of underlying it, there was some sort of slightly more worrying things about it. you know, I mentioned once you paid your membership, so it was a subscription. You joined by family, and it was run by some doctors whose interest was in how you could promote the conditions that would improve the health and well-being in a very broad sense, not just kind of dealing with illnesses, but kind of broader sense that we would recognize today, I think, how you promote well-being. But it was an experiment for them, and hence the title. And there's a kind of strong strand of eugenics going on in there, which was about lots of measurement, lots of how do we make the working classes stronger and healthier, but also we actually only want to deal with the respectable working classes who can afford to come here, because the kind of the unemployed and the manual labouring poor were possibly going to screw up their results. So yes, it's a kind of Eden, but it's also got this odd thing running through it. And of course, as Charlie is very explicit about at points in the book, the whole model of health was based on the doctors described as an organic model of families being mothers and fathers and children, and that really doesn't leave a lot of space for a gay child like Charlie. Doesn't have gay at the time necessarily, but looking back at it, he's thinking, you know, the doctors were promoting maturity. There is no way that he could have matured in that environment in the eyes of the people who ran it, because he's an aberration. So again, it's that kind of, if it's an Eden, it's got some fairly big serpents in it. And it kind of operates within the book in terms of the narrative of the book as this kind of lost idyll that in retrospect isn't quite so idyllic, certainly for him, and it's part of what sets Charlie apart from his brother and from some of the other, you know, society more generally, I guess. You find a point in it?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because you do get this sense that there was a kind of idea of holistic health that we're maybe losing as we're going further and further down the route of privatization in the NHS. But also you look.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think there's it's not that we're losing that now. The reason that the centre closed, I mean, it closed during the war, but then reopened. It closed again in 1950 because the NHS stamped it out. It wasn't that they were once interested in this stuff. It's that the NHS is actually, for all its glories, has always been interested in dealing with disease and illness fundamentally, and not in promoting health.
I maybe put it badly, but I meant a little bit more as a kind of populace. As our government is pushing us towards this kind of neoliberal individualism, where we're forgetting about so much of what it might mean to have community and to have health be part of the community. It may be something that we're missing in a lot of Southeast London, East London, a lot of deprived areas. So it is really interesting that you've used something that has that is an Eden with lots and lots and lots of snakes in it, because I think sometimes it's hard to look back at these kind of things without rose-tinted glasses, which brings me to my question about Charlie's sexuality, which you did just mention there. Is that a part of it? Is that what makes his sexuality important? Is it important to drive the novel?
I think it's an important part of who he is. And at one level, that sounds, you know, statement of the bleeding obvious, doesn't it? But again, it's without going down these people tell me what to write when they don't actually exist, and obviously I do the writing. He did kind of announce himself as being gay, and I thought long and hard about whether to to do that, you know, because it actually becomes one of the things that that helps feed the anxiety that you were talking about earlier, which again, I hesitate about saying, because what I'm not trying to suggest is that being gay is a form of anxiety. But you have to remember that Charlie was a fairly flamboyant gay man when homosexual acts were illegal until he was 36. And even after that, you know, even after the Legalization Act in 67, lots of people were prosecuted for gross indecency. So it becomes part of what it is that makes him view what he's doing from a slight angle, and he operates at a tangent to the kind of ideals that he does have. It's not that he doesn't believe in the, you know, he's the one who's a Communist Party member, not his brother, for a start. He is committed to building the New Jerusalem and to, you know, improving the lot of the poor. He genuinely is. But, you know, there are things that make it difficult for him, or make him mean that he doesn't want to try and achieve that in the same way that his brother does, by this kind of, you know, JJ's commitment, as I said right at the start, is much less complicated, and it's, in a way, it's simpler for him. He goes to work for the council and he runs the housing department and da. So Charlie, by comparison, always feels slightly at one remove and slightly at odds with the kind of the ideals that he actually nonetheless genuinely believes in. And, you know, part of that is bound up with the kind of people that he meets, and, you know, as a result of being gay and moving from the public to the private sector, which he does, as he says, you know, because he thinks it will be fun, and then he kind of admits that by fun what he actually means is he'll get more sex. And all of that gives him a kind of a hinterland, I suppose, as a character, but also, as you know, that's really actually quite important in driving the way the book goes and the way his relationship with his brother goes, and not to mention the kind of complicated relationship he has with his sister-in-law, that screws them both up to an extent. But I think, yeah, to answer the question more with fewer words, it's that kind of putting himself at a tangent and feeling like he is slightly outside what's going on, and therefore observing himself. And that's both his sense of anxiety, but also his sense of superiority, I guess, and self-righteousness, is that he has lived for 80 odd years being this kind of slightly on the edge of the society or the profession or the community that he lives in.
Thank you. That's really interesting. That actually made me think. So we gave our subscribers a chance to email us in a couple of questions, and one of them was about the role of women in your book, because you just mentioned his difficult relationship. We have his niece Diana. Am I remembering correctly?
Yep.
His sister-in-law as well, and kind of his and his brother's relationships to the tragedies that occur in the book, without giving too much away. So yeah, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the way that you've involved the women in this book, because yeah, we do have quite a strong character, and we're really inside his brain while he's dismissing so many people around him, while also having them as really main characters in his story.
Thank you. I'm glad you put it that way, because going back to your first question about the kind of voice and the narrative form of it. The danger of a monologue, but also the strength of the monologue, is that you only get Charlie's view of the world. And so finding a way in which you can allow those other characters to kind of get a word in edge piece, frankly, it's quite important, but sufficiently for a reader to see that there may be more to them than Charlie allows. And I feel very sorry for Diana, his niece, I have to say, who
did I.
is 70 odd, unmarried, again, without giving too much away. There's a backstory to that Charlie knows and is quite rude about, but hopefully in an entertaining way. And having written it, I thought, poor Diana, she really needs a chance to give her take on this. And I tried to write a second novel in which she was the principal protagonist, and I tried and tried. It didn't work, and it kind of got, well, I wrote it and then I whittled it down to a novella, and I still haven't done anything with it. It's kind of stuck in the drawer because I just couldn't.
I wonder if that's because
I had the character. What I didn't have was the story. That was the problem. Whereas here, there was not only a character but a story. But you're right. I mean, apart from Diana, and he's very rude about Diana, but obviously Diana is, she's looking after him. She's coming around every day to make sure he's safe and whatever. And he's A, rude to her, and B, openly, as you got even in the brief bit that I read, he much prefers her sister, Frances, who's the kind of the favourite niece, who of course doesn't come round daily, regularly, bothering him, and is therefore can be much favoured, but has been all through her life. I'll come back to B in a minute, the sister-in-law. The other obviously quite formative character is Angela, the boy's much older sister, who effectively steps in for their mother after the war. And again, as you got in that brief excerpt, has a drinking problem that takes her to a fairly sticky end somewhere in the early 70s. But again, a very powerful character, I hope, whose ability to manage her slightly feckless husband and the two boys that she effectively inherits as children, although they're her brothers, and her two daughters her own. So again, hopefully not a straightforward story, a mix of light and dark, but quite a formative influence on Charlie in ways that, as I said, I hope, although it's all his words, come through. B, the sister-in-law, again, is brighter and livelier than her husband. And it's a bit like Charlie's reaction to his nieces. He prefers his sister-in-law to his brother, frankly, because she's more fun to talk to. She's more engaging. And there's this sort of weird triangular dynamic in which they, at times, Charlie and B are like the parents of JJ, who's actually B's husband. He's like sort of slightly cussed school child at times, kind of being grumpy and depressed because the tower block they built has collapsed, and Charlie and B are kind of arguing about how to respond to that, what they should do, and whether he should resign, or whether the right thing to do is to resign as a to show that you're kind of taking responsibility, or to take responsibility by rebuilding things and making them better. I mean, back to your earlier question, kind of fundamental question of the book, what do you do in an imperfect world? Do you step away from it, or do you try and make it better? And so they have slightly, Charlie and B take different views on that, head in different directions. Again, limiting the spoilers, but lots of the the way the story is told means that you get to learn quite a lot of this quite early on. It's it kind of wrecks B and JJ's marriage. But it's
quite unsurprisingly.
Well, yes, I mean, I trust that's believable, but also in the way that it's you know, she has her you know, her own background and her slightly aristocratic mother and her kind of slightly higher the lady is in inverted commas, but clearly comes from more money than the boys do. And
which maybe is why she's got I suppose is more impassioned with her ideals than others are afforded to be.
I think it's yes, and there's an element of that. I mean, it's a bit of a cheap shot in a way, but there is an element of that by then mid-70s, you know, middle class radicalism, which, you know, there's a cheap joke about nuclear free zones and such like, but there was some truth. You know, the reason that those stories are slightly cliched is that there is a degree of truth about some of the radicalism that was going on in London in particular, but I dare say elsewhere, by the mid-70s, and she is very much part of that. But again, she's doing good. She's, as she sees it, she's fighting for the tenants in this estate. She eventually gets disillusioned and retires off to Suffolk with her wife and dogs and whatever. You know, which again, you know, is not uncommon as a life trajectory. But it's not that she's yes, she passes judgment, but that's not all she does. You know, she's committed herself when they start. She's the one who's dragging them out onto street demonstrations in the 50s and the 60s, and she is as committed as they are. But they're, you know, the three of them, you know, have commitments that eventually wind up in rather different places.
Yeah, I did. I found it really interesting because I feel like that kind of disdain that he has, maybe that's not entirely accurate, but his liking less of his brother in comparison to his sister-in-law, and it felt to me like a lot of what drove Charlie's relationships was how entertained he could be by the other people. And it always seemed to me as though a lot of the men in the story were kind of amusing puppets, whereas the women were these kind of fully fleshed out people to him, which I found just really, really interesting, that he could brush off Diana, but so, you know, wholeheartedly believe in his sister and the two girls on the farm. I think one was called Hope. Am I remembering? Which I found really interesting.
Hope and Faith.
So I think we maybe have time for just 2 more questions. So I'm going to ask you another one of the subscriber ones, and then end with just something that I want to know the answer to. Just something maybe a little bit more whimsical. So that question is, do you have any hope for council housing in the real world? Maybe not in Charlie's and
do
JJ's
I have any
world,
hope at all?
Do you think that there's a chance that we could revive that kind of initial ideal of council housing, that quite utopian council housing, maybe?
I fear not. It doesn't mean that we can't do something about the insanity of the housing market, although, you know, I'm not confident about that either. We've got ourselves into a world where the where, you know, property is so divorced from its purpose. You know, we have houses to live in, but actually we don't. We have them as investment vehicles that are there to, you know, if you're lucky and you own one, it's there to ensure that you've got something to pay for your care home when you can no longer look after yourself. And, you know, maybe pass something on to your children if that's your bag. And none of that has any relationship to what a house is for, which is, you know, to keep you warm and safe and dry. And trying to get back to a view that is about, you know, whoever actually is the provider, to a view that says we need to get off that that kind of escalator, because it is madness. You know, we now have you know, average house prices in London and in Edinburgh, I'm sure, certainly in a number of cities in England, that are 15, 16, 18 times average earnings. And that makes no sense whatsoever. So somehow or other, we've got to revive a world in which, as I said, whoever is providing and managing them, housing is not seen as an investment vehicle. It's seen as a good, as a public piece of public infrastructure. In reality, to do that, then you've got to find some way of removing the profit motive from it. But then you run into, do we currently have a world, do we have a hope for a world in which those would, you know, the way to do that would be to say to local authorities, go and build a lot more housing. And I'm not convinced that we have a government or a government in waiting for whom that is the answer. Now, in some ways, you know, dyed-in-the-wool local government advocate as I am, I'm sort of, you know, perhaps it's more important than somebody does it than who does it. But I do worry, you know, that at one point housing associations were kind of emerging as a kind of hybrid model that was enabling some of that to happen, and social housing kind of still has, to be fair, but it's becoming increasingly commercialized, and you know, it's not without its own problems. The 2 buildings down from the Peckham Experiment, there is a block where this time last year, I think, a woman, Sheila Seloani, was found dead in her flat. It was a Peabody flat, so, you know, one of the more responsible housing associations. If you look up the story, she was either age 58 or 61, and the reason for the discrepancy is that she was in the flat for 2.5 years, dead, before anybody found her. Which kind of suggests that, you know, there is something wrong with the model of managing, you know, what was supposed to be social housing. This isn't a straight answer to your question. What I'm getting at, I think, is that in order to get back to something that is providing housing as a social good, we've got to find a mechanism that takes the commercial profit interest out of it. And that is going to take a huge amount of political will and courage, I guess, which, you know, not to be too downbeat, I don't actually see on the front bench of the Labour Party right now.
I'd agree with you. I mean,
you know, these things.
Be real.
The other thing that looking back at 60, 70 years of social history gives you is, as I said, the story isn't straightforward. It isn't up and down in one go. And, you know, the universe does not have a moral arc. It kind of wiggles about all over the place. And there have been times before, you know, the 1930s among them, the 1960s and 50s as well, where, you know, frankly, the state of housing was a lot worse than it is now. Bloody awful as it is now. You know, the differences are obviously there, but, you know, who's to say that, you know, when you get to a point where you can't run a city because nobody can afford to live in it who's got to work in it, then something will have to give eventually. And, you know, hopefully it'll give in the right direction.
No, I think that's a great answer. And I feel like a lot of what I was hearing from that as well is that that kind of, it's better that someone does it, then who does it maybe, but that we're maybe lacking in compassion, which is kind of a prerequisite for hope, I suppose. Yeah.
I guess it is.
Just
but there is a character called Hope, as you pointed out in the book, just to give everybody a bit of a lift.
Yeah. And faith.
And faith. But as he says, they never got round to charity. But
well, I did enjoy that joke. So just really quickly, purely out of interest, I was wondering, when I was reading it, the way that I pictured it, I feel is the kind of way you might see a film. You've got this kind of like memory flashback happening from an old man drinking on his own in a flat he doesn't like particularly, as far as I can tell. So I was just wondering if there were any films that helped inspire you, or if maybe thinking about it now you're like, oh, actually, do you know what I would recommend someone watch after reading my book? It's this.
That is a bit of a left field question, not one I've been asked before.
I mean, if you don't have an answer,
give it a thought. But just before I do though, does he like it or not? Well, he kind of does, but it's a penance. He's moved back in there partly out of guilt, because I didn't say earlier, the Pioneer Centre where the Peckham Experiment was based is now a block of luxury flats because the local council sold it for redevelopment. When I worked for them, funnily enough, in 1992. Films. I don't think I'm not a huge film buff, but I think there's a sort of backlog of cultural stuff going on in my head that's lodged there. And you'll notice that there's a lot of songs in the book, and that's partly because it's kind of way of triggering memories and kind of word association for Charlie and jumping from one part of his story to another. I don't think there's a kind of, there's not a film or a style of film, but I think there are a number of, in the same way as the music, there are a number of sort of bits and pieces. So that kind of give me a sort of sense or a feel for the era that not necessarily films, but documentaries. So there's a reference to, all those kind of things that we know about the 60s actually come from, depending on how old we are. My case, some direct memories, but mostly my direct memories are overlaid with, seeing things on the television of, young women in very short skirts and beehive hairdos, dancing on the telly or walking around Carnaby Street. And there's some of that kind of informs the way that that Charlie too kind of remembers and presents. There was one very specific one, I have to say. There's a bit when they're evacuated during the war, and it's with Hope actually, when they're restoring the old motorbike, and getting it working, and there's the scene where they ride out on the motorbike. After I wrote that, I thought I couldn't get out of my head that bit and the bicycle in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It's not that it's directly relevant, but it's just that kind of sun-dappled, happy music playing, different era, but and there's 3 of them on the bike, not 2, but that's part of the story. But just that kind of scene of, it's a kind of high point emotionally, when they get this going and ride it off around the farm.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's exactly what I meant, because I mean, memories being told in this way kind of create a montage for you, so it makes sense that there are little bits that jump out at you. Although I did have this constant sense, this feeling that there was a film popping up in my head, but I cannot for the life of me figure out what it is.
Perhaps we need to talk to a producer and get it made.
Unlike Charlie, I have a pretty horrific memory, so that's on me for asking a question I can't help answer anyway. Thank you so much, Guy. This was really great. It was amazing to hear more about your work, what brought you to write this book, and the characters in it. and how they did come at you with the story this time. Yeah.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for putting it in your subscribers box. It's I'm really grateful. It's great to see it getting out.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's definitely going to be on our table display for a while yet.
Cool.
Amazing. Thank you.
Great. Thanks again.